This is next piece. Will raise concerns. But the first, I'm going to mention the term civil, which, like civilian, derives from civilis, which means to affect fellow citizens in a legal or political sense. So perhaps now you understand why they called it the Civil War. They affected citizens in a legal or political sense. Civil War was 1861, which was the last year we had a real American government and also the organic constitution. Makes more sense now, doesn't it, than ending slavery, as his story tells you. They just enslaved everyone, not just the indigenous people or the Africans or the people from the Caribbean who were here then. Everyone. Now, I must give some credits to a guy by the name of Dane Calloway for this next piece, or some of it anyway. And you can go and check him out. He is a black guy on YouTube. But did you know, or have you ever heard of the American Holocaust? Nope. Don't know. Much like the Russian Holocaust of 2 years prior, in 1919, the American military and the federal government bombed the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 and killed many thousands of people of colour who had at that time developed efficient, numerous and prosperous businesses within that region, the most popular being mass agriculture. They were accused of being capitalists in an industrial society and bombed into oblivion by the US Army planes at the behest of the federal government under an executive order called martial law, which was created by Congress and President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. That will be a common theme. Now, the indigenous people in Greenwood district of Tulsa had created their own banks in 1865 called the Freedman Savings and Trust Bank, which upon opening had over 72,000 accounts and had deposits of $52 million, which is the equivalent to over $100 billion today, and made it the largest grossing bank in American history at that time. Within a month of agreeing with that deal, President Lincoln was assassinated and things began to go north, not south. And in came President Andrew Johnson, who was a native of Newcastle, England, another Democrat, who took over the presidency by default, and who was another who was involved in and links with the fledgling KKK, which was formed as an official group in December 1865, and no, it's not a coincidence, and the more lesser-known group known as the Night Riders 1 week later on New Year's Day 1866. Both of these groups were born out of the Democratic Party, like the German Democratic Party. Same people, same plans, same ideologies. like their symbols on the subsequent flags like Antifa, are exactly the same as the earlier named National Socialist Party, but were actually the Social Democratic Party, later known as the Nazi Party in Germany. Another massacre his story has not revealed too readily either was committed by a Democratic mayor, the Ku Klux Klan, who also joined up with the New Orleans police at a Republican convention whereby they attacked and killed 40 blacks, 20 whites, and wounded 150 others in 1868. The Klan then released push cards, which are a bit like baseball cards, with a list of 63 Republicans designated to be killed, 50 of whom were black and 13 white, and this was in South Carolina. They then passed laws against the Indigenous Negroes, as they were called, where bearing arms was banned, limited the abilities for the native groups to continue to be prosperous economically, banned group gatherings, barred blacks from renting or buying land, barred them from serving on juries, voting by the blacks was prohibited, and decided that black orphans could be put into forced labour. And then the classic. Negroes learning to read and write became a criminal offence. I've used that term deliberately. You'll find out why. This was known as the Black Codes of 1865. Harassment and forced incarcerations based on largely trumped-up charges then forced them into labour camps, and the slavery racket abolished by Lincoln and others was washed away into his story. But these Negro businesses, as they were called back then, the term Negro was first used by the Portuguese. It meant dark-skinned. But they were not all African Negroes at all, but Indian Negroes. There was an influx of Africans when word got out of Africa that there was prosperity to be made working in America, not Africa. And in fact, much of the African labour was traded to the Middle East countries by the East African Slave Trade Group long before Europeans arrived. The myth, supported by the documentation, of an African slave migration to the Americas is just that, a myth. There was a very successful, hard-working business-like population here, the indigenous Native Americans with an influx of Caribbean people, but the majority of peoples here were not descendants of black African slaves, but actually indigenous natives. The abolition of the Slavery Act was essentially a ruse. They were adopting a new free enterprise system, but neither the North or the South were operating as well as the indigenous peoples. They couldn't farm the land, they had less businesses that were profitable, and less banks also. And they were concerned the indigenous were becoming capitalists and self-sustaining when they wanted an industrial-style output which they controlled. So in other words, what they went with in this new enterprise system was, you teach us what we can't do, and then we can steal it all from you, so you can forget all the slavery nonsense you've been told in schools, colleges and academias. They all spoke of pre-written scripts given to them by the same group of scumbags today we call the cabal. But there's another hidden element to this so-called white supremacy movement. that was implemented by the Founding Fathers, yes them, successive American presidents, the police, the judges and the Ku Klux Klan, who were all affiliated by one group, the Freemasons, and in particular the Scottish Rite group. It is they that have subverted American history, they who raped and pillaged the indigenous black Indians, they who destroyed the prosperous businesses shared by many and corralled into the few. It was they who built the Egyptian-style obelisks, they who built Washington, D.C. into a pentagram shape, and they who brought into New York Harbor the so-called Lady Liberty, which was built and sent by French Freemasons. Another trick played on the American people. It barely looks like a lady at all, and it was certainly nothing to do with liberty for anyone of Turtle Island, as the Americas was once known. The Out of Africa theory was formulated in the 1920s by a Jewish person aligned with the Carnegies, the Ford Institute and others in the Anthropological Society by the name of Melville Herskovits. And all evidence points to the fact that this was deliberately created theory designed to deny the people of colour their inherent right to the land in America. I wonder how many people listening to this show knew Malcolm X was not representing the people of colour, but he was representing the group known as the Nation of Islam. Can you imagine Malcolm X lasting in America nowadays with so many anti-Muslim based on portal people fear programs? Question is, was Malcolm X a stooge for a future program of the Muslim Brotherhood? And for those that don't know, the Muslim Brotherhood is nothing to do with Muslims and everything to do with Langley 3, Obama and their divide and conquer tactics. George Washington initiated the 1790 Census Act to document all peoples in America, and people of colour came under one bracket based on official guidelines set by the government, and all records that would substantiate most people of colour were indigenous and not African between 1790 and 1890 was all erased on January 1921, just 5 months before the American Holocaust we mentioned at the top of this piece, and it all went up in flames in a fire. Funny that, isn't it? How so many fires globally burnt so much his story. Actually, it's our story. You see, false flags have been going on a long time. 1666, fire of London. Deliberate. In fact, most of Europe was burnt through the 16 and 1700s to erase history and people so they could rewrite a new one. The fire in Washington, D.C. that was part of one of the wars with Britain. It's all staged. The fires in Germany in 1933. Again, staged. Alexandria, the library. Don't think they burnt everything, do you? I can tell you they never. So, Around 1920, 21, having burnt all the records, and the Melville Herskovich was formulating the out of Africa theory. But it was also supported and perpetrated by a guy by the name of Francis Galton and his sidekick Charles Darwin, yes him, who both took part in the initial program called eugenics, natural selection, one group better than the other, and essentially the beginning of labelling, boxing people up, and what is now known by the term racial profiling, the classic divide and conquer tactic of the criminal elites. In 1924, Virginia's ruling elite enacted the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, stating the following: that all state officials backed by a guy by the name of Walter Plecker, not a German, who is documented as writing to Walter Gross, the director of Germany's Bureau of Human Betterment and Eugenics Group, says it all, then directed all state and local courthouse records to be destroyed and reclassify all people who are non-white to be labelled coloured. This was to hide those people who those people really are, or where they were from. People calling themselves Native American from that date also, under this act, risked facing a 1-year jail sentence. All Indians were then classified as coloured. You see, it was all about the pseudoscience called eugenics, natural selection. And you all thought that racial purity started with Hitler and the Nazis. Think again. This was started before he was even born. That particular act, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, held until 1968, when the US Supreme Court forced Virginia to repeal the law, and the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was overturned. Now, in the subsequent time between 1924 and 1968, the identity of these people was changed 5 times on their birth certificates and licenses. It went from coloured to Negro to mulatto to Creole and then black. The reality is, in this country, despite the fake genealogy tests tell you, yes, you, Ancestry.com and 23andMe, all fake. And I mean all fake. %98 of people known as African Americans in this country are actually Indigenous, Aboriginal, Indians. His story now becomes their story.